this matters. This matters to us, even if we struggle to understand art. So let's open it up for questions. Got our first one here, yeah?
I first wanted to say your theological analysis was great. I've always sort of disliked modern art, but being a Lutheran, seeing it in that sort of perspective, I may not be able to like it, but at least I can sort of understand it. But I don't think you're entirely fair to pre-modern artists. They can express a great deal of pain and misery and the theology of the cross as well as theology of glory. Especially if you're looking at a gargoyle in a medieval church or Christ crucified. That is theology of the cross by definition.
That's good.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I absolutely grant that.
Good. Yeah, Dan.
I have a question at the end of a brief story. I wrote a dissertation on vorticism, and my favorite work from that was by a French sculptor named Henri Gaudibresca called The Hieratic Head of Ezra Pound. And I just identified it with it in many ways and had a poster of it for many years. And finally, maybe 10 years ago, I had a chance to see it in London, and it was kind of one of these sacred moments where you actually get to see the piece that you've admired so long. And it was a kind of a moving thing, I spent a lot of time circling it. All right, but then I found out from looking at the program that it was a copy. And my question is, should that matter?
What kind of copy?
Well, it was a sculpture reproduced. I mean, it's about 4 feet tall. It's the only big piece of stone that Gaudibresca had to work with, and he was killed in World War I. And it's just this powerful expression of the intellectual, and somebody just, I don't know how they copied it, but it turned,
Was it stone?
Yeah, it was in stone. Yeah. It was said to be a copy or a replica of the piece.
So you're asking my.
Well, did I have a
qualified?
Well, did I?
You had an authentic experience.
Okay, so it doesn't matter that it was a replica.
Well, it depends. I mean, no. It really doesn't. It affirms it's a tangible manifestation of what you've spent a portion of your life working on. So,
would it matter if I ever saw it?
The original?
No, I never saw the piece at all. I mean, I responded to photographs.
Sure. I think so. Yeah. I think so. And I also think it's interesting. I look at, I go to the Louvre, go to Paris. You go to the Louvre. You go watch people. Go to Leonardo's Mona Lisa, and there's such a draw to go see it with such an aura and expectation that this is art. And they look at it and it's small and they don't have an experience in front of them. So they go what's going on? I think that's really interesting. And so the aspect of the kind of experience is one that can be just a subtle, I think there's a sense, there's an urgency that I experience, but it's something that grows over time. There's a burn of some kind. There's you find out you actually have relationships with songs and poems and novels and paintings and all those sorts of things. They don't have to drop you to your knees, and the skies don't have to open. It happened for me in thinking about Cézanne. It happened really after I went. I mean, I looked at this work. It was important to me. MoMA means something to me, and it helps me re-energize why I was there as a kid, Nebraskan, in New York in the late 80s, which was pre-cleaned up. It was Mayor Dinkins. It was you don't go to Central Park. It was and I remember coming into Penn Station and then going to the bathroom, the men's room, and what was going on in there. I was like, what the heck? you know, but that was the energy. I was there, and this was why. And so, but it was upon reflection that I began to think about this and began to think, what was it actually doing? So it doesn't necessarily even have to, that experience doesn't necessarily have to be there at the moment, dropping to your knees, and then you find out maybe that it's not, that it's a copy. I think it's still an important moment, and it's an important moment for you as it affirms your tangible relationship with the work that you've had imaginatively and that you've seen in imagery, and it continues to grow. So I don't think that's an illegitimate experience at all.
I want to know what you taught your children about modern art, because what you described is a sort of adolescent or adult experience.
Yeah.
Where modern art elicits for you a lot of rawness and darkness and things we need to be attentive to.
Yes.
So did you just feel like, well, this is something I do, but it's not really
That's a
appropriate to my
fantastic
children?
question.
Yeah.
Well, as a museum curator, in which our museum was on a university campus, and what docents were doing had a contract with Lincoln Public Schools in Nebraska, and so they're bringing school kids. And there was a certain kind of sense like, oh, come on, these benighted parents who are concerned about nudity. But I was very careful about making sure that in the education department that there was certain ways that you went about this, and there didn't need to be any distractions. You didn't need to, I mean, I believe that art is made for adults, and that you initiate children into it in ways that you find ways to initiate, but they're not the bottom line in terms of like what's safe for kids. You know, the Christian music stations, like what's safe for the kid that you're taking to your Christian school, you know, is like the baseline. I'm very careful about it. And so it was puppies and doggies, and look at that.
But like Rothko or something, I mean.
Well, Rothko, I mean, like, there's hardly much, I mean, like, look at the colors, or that there's a landscape, you know, and there's some aspects of that. I don't need to tell. You know what Rothko said, it was like risky business to send a painting out in the world. Now, what I'd also have to say is my family is, they were in the project. They're in it too. My oldest son is a mechanic, a hunter living in Nebraska. He doesn't like think about art, but he's lived with it. He's lived with artists. He's friends with the artists that I've worked with. And so he knows it though from a different perspective, but he's not interested. He went one semester to college and he's just that, but there's something, he lives it, he knows it. He'll send me pictures of art things that he encounters, you know. My middle daughter is going to be a senior at King's College in New York City, and she's studying art, and one of the pleasures I have is she's a student in my classes, and she's my TA, and I'm her mentor. And I have to struggle with the fact that it's like, gosh, you know, like one of the things I do in the classroom is I'm pretty vulnerable and direct, and I find myself thinking, I see her, but it's not new to her. She felt it. I mean, we moved from Nebraska to Miami, Florida to work with an artist. Like their whole life was upended for Dad in his pursuit of art. Like they're in it. And so she's experienced it in a particular way, and as she's gotten older, she's experiencing it, she's integrating it in a different kind of way, but I'm let her do that. And so I think those are really, I think that's, you know, extremely important question to think about different ways. I don't know how to, any other way to do it, but I'm very respectful of, it's just not, there are things that aren't appropriate. It's just, and I just want to make sure that and you get that, ease into that, and that's something that you can get at from from different ways, but my family saw it in my eyes, saw it, experienced it, felt it in different kinds of ways. So, good question. Yeah.
I have something that piggybacks off that. That brought back an experience, so a little story and then a question. I brought my kids to the Walker for a family night, and my father, who's an old Lutheran pastor, was there as well. The grandfather with his grandchildren walking through, and we came upon a piece of art which I'll just say he felt was vulgar. In many ways, I guess you could almost say that. And there are my children, young children, and he kind of moved him around that piece. And my father there said, it seems, and he said to all of us, it seems as if this artist has forgotten the image of God. And I thought that was a really interesting way to address that with my children. And I'd like to hear your perspective on that statement about modern art.
I think that's a really interesting. That's an interesting question, and I think part of the modern. I mean, the important aspect of the modern tradition is making paintings and visual imagery in the wake of a tremendous paradigm shift in which God's not present in the same way. That it's not obvious. It's not a default mechanism in terms of a theological worldview that's just presumed. That God's there, but kind of there to the side. You're going to do work here, and there's a distance, and there's an emptiness. Nature isn't creation as it is, say, in a medieval, pre-modern worldview. It's nature, red in tooth and claw. And in the 19th century, it's just there to destroy you. It is like nature is like God's not, whatever God can be yours, but he's just not there for everybody, and everybody understands the image of God. In so many ways, the modern artist goes into the studio and tries to deal with that. Like living, what does it mean to live without the image of God? And certainly being a Christian and claiming a Christian belief and living as a Christian on this side of modernity is different than living as a Christian in 15th century Florence. And in many ways where unbelief is the default, where God is distant. And so where is God? Well, God's in here. Then in the medieval worldview, or in the theological tradition, everything meant something Christological. The rose had Christological. Peacock had a Christological meaning. All of those apocryphal stories, all of that aspect was that God was near, and that everything was analogously an image of God. It's symbolic. It points you right up there. So God's present and clear. There's an emptiness in the modern tradition. There's just an emptiness you're trying to figure out how to put back together again. Like that's what, for me, from epistemological standpoint, it's what made Kant so fascinating to me. Kant's like, okay, God's God. Okay, we're going to put him to the side, and we're going to do philosophy without it. All of a sudden, like everything shifts and moves around. It's like, wait a second. Okay, the mind now has to construct it. Reason has to put it together, but it puts together, and it's put together kind of odd and strange, and then it creates all these other problems, and all these other thinkers come out and say, hey, wait a second, how do we clean this up and fix this? How do we think about this differently? Like all of those sorts of things are coming out where that image of God is changed. And so recovering it in a different kind of way, maybe, or expressing that loss. And it's not insignificant that artists, you have that imagery. The imagery, the iconography exists in the modern tradition. It just doesn't function in the same kind of way that it. So the crucifix is used. The crucifixion is used in different ways. So interesting. I was at Minneapolis Institute of Art today. First time I've been there. Amazing. Amazing. And you see these paintings between the war years, from First World War and right after, and all of a sudden you see all these non-Christian artists painting crucifixions. That's interesting. Like, the imagery is there, the pathos but it's doing something different. There's something else there. And I think in terms of sharing that with your children, I think that's absolutely right.
Hi. So.
You don't mind if we have a conversation? Sorry.
So, if in modern art, God is, or the question of God or the relationship with God is somewhat removed from the artist and what he's trying to communicate in a different way than what happened during the medieval era, like you were just saying. What then do we do with modern church architecture or art? Like explicitly religious art that's modern and has that edge.
Why are you asking this?
Yeah, I mean, but what
Yeah.
I think amongst the young Christian, fairly traditional community, there is this strong, like, anti-hatred of anything modern in terms of church architecture. And if it is speaking theologically, then what are we? Can they coexist? Can that be a legitimate medium for the modern artist, or can it not? Would it be
The modern religious artist? Or, I mean, what exactly are you asking?
Can you make a modern church? That's what I'm asking you. Like, a church, a reverent, beautiful church that is, I know those are loaded terms, that is in the style of a modern artist.
Oh, I would imagine so, but one of the difficulties is figuring out what isn't anachronistic in terms of taking. I mean, I find the categories of the good, the true, the beautiful just unproductive. I'll just admit it. Unproductive. The kinds of abstractions that operate as guides within we begin to, because it's just so often, every single time somebody talks about the good, the true, and the beautiful, the artwork is pretty easy and conventional. And so they're just big abstract words that conjure up Aristotelian or Platonic, that presuppose there's a particular kind of standard, and then what you get is you get something that's so tame. Beauty is terrifying. Truth is terrifying. The good is terrifying. It's not bourgeois, middle class, suburban, good, true, and the beautiful. But I would also say, I feel that there's a lot of pressure. I'll speak to a lot of churches, a lot of Presbyterian churches, PCA churches, that feel some pressure with art. And oftentimes, in environments that have robust art worlds, what do we do? How do we understand? And it can be anachronistic to say, let's have artists put their work up in the sanctuary. I find that to be problematic. It doesn't need to happen. There can be, I would suggest, and I will often say, is there a space that you can be a gallery space where it's actually serving? You're not making artists, bless you, that are trained at the University of Minnesota, getting MFAs, thinking about the history, thinking about being initiated into a cultural practice with a particular kind of history. And then using the sanctuary as kind of an exhibition space for that work. That it can operate, a space that operates as outreach. It's a space that can be creative. It's a space that can that can generate a vibrant artistic practice, that the church can love their neighbor and their community by doing that. But sometimes what a church needs are those artists who are being trained to make really fine visual distinctions, or architects who are making fine visual distinctions. Have them come in and walk around the church grounds, go into the spaces, experience the aesthetic aspect of the hallway, the sanctuary, the church, the environment, and have them think about ways that aesthetically that can contribute to creating an aesthetic experience that actually facilitates the worship, because that's what the architecture is about. It's not just a sign or a symbol from the outside that harkens back to some kinds of values. It's something that actually is preparing aesthetically human beings to hear the Word of God and to worship and experience. So there are all kinds of things that fight against it, but we don't know. We know because we're not cognate. We're not cognitive of it. We're not conceptualizing it, but we feel it. We feel that there's something off. And maybe what can be alleviated and emphasized are fresh cut flowers every Sunday at this place. And maybe there's a smell, or the fact that people go by and there's an area where the custodian puts chairs and it just has a sense of like crowded and crampedness, or just there's some sense that if it cleans things out and opens things up a little bit, it doesn't need to be a painting. It doesn't need to be art that's there. It can be that aesthetic aspect of artists and architects and designers who make a living and whose vocation is aesthetically oriented. Having them look at that space. And now you're getting at architectural space that is adaptive to that place, that happens to be a place in the mall or sort of like wherever. Like the realities of, you can't buy a plot of land and then spend 200 years building it out of stone. You can't. Well, you're used to, but you can't. I mean, it's just not like. It is what it is. Like my wife and I were in Paris last month. We're having an amazing experience in St. Severin Church, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, it was so hot. It's like 100 degrees outside. Like every time we're there, it's like triple digits. It's amazing. But we go inside and it's cool." She's like, "This is amazing. Gosh, I wish there were churches like this." I know, but it took like 200 years to make these things. Like, it's incredible now, they live with them, but goodness, like multi-generational, we just can't do that. And you kind of have to take what you take. And the real estate is real estate. So what do? You know, how do you make this place a place that is comfortable and open up dialogue, and you work with those spaces? So I think there is potential, but it has to be responsive to that moment. I mean, part of the modern tradition is the modern artists were not rejecting. Cézanne wasn't rejecting the Renaissance past. What he was rejecting was its reification, its transformation into a kind of technology that was operating in the academy, which was being generated, on an assembly line of nymphs and cherubs and putti and all the kinds of stuff that operated in this realm of quasi-Judeo-Christian imagery and titillating classical antiquity. They're just like, get back to the magic of Raphael and Piero della Francesca, and let's get back to them. They would go to the Louvre and they would look at these paintings and they would copy these paintings. But what they felt that the modern artists needed to be responsive to modern. The putti and the angels were appropriate in this particular worldview in which that world was. But there's a different world that the foundation is shifting and changing, and we're trying to figure all that out. And so the painting needed to, the work needed to respond to modern life, needed to respond to in some way. And so I think part of that vision is to be responsive to that rather than saying, need to go back here and take this form. I mean, and that's the danger that I run into. I look at, I find 19th century stuff so interesting and fascinating, and I just kind of want to make Cézanne and Matisse, and that's just like, that's the place right there. And the contemporary world is just kind of, oh God, the Whitney Biennial or the Walker, it's like, oh. But I have to remind myself that what I'm doing is am I being the academic, the academician that is reifying that little place? I have to admit, I've got to be able to open up that space and be responsive again. It forces me to shuffle the deck again, to think about art in different ways, and think about Cézanne in relationship to Facebook and Twitter stuff, and Instagram, and all of those kinds of things that I want to. That I go, like, how do I understand that in relationship to? I just want my white cube with my paintings. Okay, that's my desire. So I have to kind of get out of that. I have to force myself to try to get out of that.
Yeah, a question. Do you the word modernity? Do you make a firm distinction, a hard line in history where that happens, or do you use that word because everyone else likes to use that word? Like, I'm an architect, and I practice modern architecture. And I fight every day with the definition of what's modern, and it gets rejected. It gets this, it's rejected. But of course, there's no hard line. I mean, the roots of modernity are 200 years old.
Oh, that question.
And so it's a very easy, smooth transition from 19th century to 20th century. There's not a hard line, but everyone wants to understand the difference. They want to step here or there, on the carpet or on the hardwood. Yeah. Why do you use that word?
Just a device. It's a way for me to think through things. I find there are certain ways. It's a, as Wittgenstein says with thought, it's a ladder to get me to one place to another, and then I get rid of the ladder. I mean, I'll spend the next 2 hours talking about modernity from different perspectives, and talking about it in the context of 15th century Florence, and talking about it in terms of what's taking place in the late 18th century. I mean, you keep pushing modernity back. Sociology and the history of sociology is operating within certain contexts of the modern paradigm. I mean, part of the argument, the contestation of what is modernity is modernity. It's part of that. What does it mean to be modern is part of modernity. There's a recognition somehow that there are certain shifts, and it's an interesting way of thinking about it. Looking at in terms of how do you define modern theology? Thinking about theology from the perspective of modernity, and how to understand that, and where does that start, and our history, and so. But there are certain ways of describing it that for me I have just particular rhetorical, polemical, heuristic device to define it. That's why I'll define it 30 different other ways if we need to, just to find a different way to think about it differently. And I completely agree. I also don't draw. What annoys me to no end is the postmodern thing, is to say, well, that's just a way to dismiss things. Postmodern. What exactly does that mean? Are you being modern? Does that mean you're modern? And then you're being postmodern? What does that mean? And that poses all kinds of questions. And I just assume I don't even use that word. But I'm interested in modern in terms of reviving it too, in many ways, because I do think that particularly in my realm, there is an aspect that modern is, as the art historian T.J. Clark said, like the new antiquity. It's like, and it's just kind of, it's past, it's just a way of, but the stakes, like I mean, we are still the the 18th and 19th century is still with us in powerful ways, still thinking those thoughts after Kant and the early German romantics, trying to think through all these relationships of the self and the other. And for me, Luther comes in beautifully. You know, everybody stands before God, or call it whatever it is. Law, demand, you know, stand before God, who judges us, and stand before the world, who judges us. Hegel's statement that it's the life and death battle for mutual recognition. You recognize me, I'll recognize you. The urgency of that. And then the whole notion of I stand before myself. Like, that doesn't go away. But all of those aspects have a certain kind of, they're handled in the church in many ways a self-evident way in whatever kind of, I struggle to find the phrase of it. You know, I don't know what pre-modern is, but there's a certain kind of way of, say, Ptolemaic cosmos. And so the modern tradition is a Copernican cosmos. Kant described his philosophy as a Copernican revolution. What changes when the earth isn't the center, when it isn't the place that has all the meaning? Now the sun is, now there's this universe that's like, that changes things. Maybe that's a way to think about things.
In different disciplines, they have set criteria for excellence. I'm wondering your thoughts on, do you think in art there's an objective way to discern quality?
Set objectives for academic in the academic context?
No, visual. So like in visual arts, do you see, like when you're approaching modern art, distinguishing between different items that artists are creating? Is there,
where's the criteria?
That's what I'm wondering.
You're asking, is there a criteria?
Is there criteria? I feel like objections that I've had in and interacting with modern art, especially with Christians, has been seeing the visual, modern visual artists kind of like decline in quality or technique or time. And so in modern art or in art in general, do you think there is an objective way to discern quality?
No. And the accusation of technical virtuosity, or that my kid can do that, many of those artists would say, yeah, that's kind of the point. That's kind of the point. Why do we listen? Maybe I'll just confess. Why do I listen to Tom Waits and Johnny Cash and musicians whose voice, Janis Joplin, whose voices are not top 40, not Taylor Swift, not those winners on Fox or whatever shows that have those voice that can adapt to, but have a voice that is distinctive, a voice that you could say is bad. Some of Dylan's voices. The music scene here in Minneapolis. Husker Du.
What music?
But you listen, it's like, compared to what? You know, like, there's, maybe you could say there's a directness or an authenticity. I think the standards begin to change. I think the standards, there aren't universal standards. But the question is, in terms of the contemporary art world and the experience that I have with working with a particular artist who has particular price points in the art world that puts him in a particular realm, a high echelon realm, where the stakes are really high for collectors, nobody trusts that they discern it. They don't tell you that. But I've had collectors tell me that they would let me know when his work is represented by Zwirner, and I'll buy it at Zwirner. They won't buy it now because the dealer is the validator. Because the last thing they want is to buy a work because they love it, have it in their fourth home in Aspen, and have a cocktail reception and nobody buy the work. And they say, who is that? what they want, and they will pay more to say, oh, that's a Werner artist. That's a Hauser and Wirth artist. That's a Gagosian artist. Now there's validation. There's authority. They don't have to say, I bought this because I loved it. They tell stories about having certain eyes and being transformed, but they are scared to death. And I love that. There's such a vulnerability to it. Such a vulnerability to it. I mean, that a Munch painting worth $120 million. The collector is on the board at MoMA. He has all kinds of agendas. He wants that work for a whole host of reasons that have less to do with him falling in love with it and more of, I'm going to have it, which means others don't. I mean, one of the things that's different from, say, painting than literature is that one person has it means others don't. Literature has had that reputation for speaking truth to power because it can be disseminated, it can be handed off, it can be memorized and then spoken. But a painting is really expensive to paint. There are lots of materials. It has always found itself amongst the powerful and the wealthy. And so it runs the risk of always being a decorative, propagandistic plaything. It was the problem in the 15th century Florence, and it's the challenge for the contemporary artist. But that's also so interesting, to be in that kind of environment and then approach painting differently. Because Matisse and these artists relied upon these collectors who were buying the work for all kinds of different purposes, while Matisse is chasing light. He's not expecting the collectors to buy it because they are chasing light. But Munch's ideal viewer, he once said about it in his journals, he said, I paint my paintings to try to achieve some kind of clarity for myself and how I relate to this world. And he said, I'm hoping that the viewers that come to my paintings will be able to use it in their search. I think that's quite beautiful. And there's some kind of covenant, there's a hope that why he's making those paintings. So Munch late in his life, lonely, can't sleep in this big house in Eckley in Norway. He's wandering about, afraid at night. He begins to paint full-length portraits of his friends when they would come and visit. I couldn't leave without him painting their full-length portrait. And many of them were haunted by it. One of them said, man, he painted my soul, and hangs it on a tack on the wall. But what Munch would do would scatter those paintings around the house. He called them his guardians. That when he couldn't sleep, he would walk around the house and they would be there for him. So even though Munch has to be, and many of these artists have to understand how their work operates in the world and have to play in that realm, many of them are operating in another, it's providing opportunity for them to do something else with that work. And it fascinates me. It fascinates me to go to a retrospective of an artist's work like Picasso's sculpture show at MoMA. Went to there and looked at it, I was amazed. This is a life. Think about vocation, think about one's life and what one does with the work of one's hands. And you look through this entire span of this man who not only made paintings, he made sculptures. And you look at through marriages, through wars, through crises, he's making this work. Like, what an amazing life as he is living this life in this context of this of a world in turmoil, his life in turmoil. Just an amazing testimony. An amazing testimony to a life of the product. And it makes me think, like, what are the things that of my career that sum me up, that are expressions of my response to the world. And that I can't quantify that in terms of a criteria, because what that presupposes is that there's a criteria to step away from. You can observe it objectively, thumbs up, thumbs down, it fits this category. But I can't make it do that. But that also doesn't mean necessarily that it's completely subjective. But sometimes those categories can cause problems. And I'm just as guilty of those categories, or falling in love with my interpretations. You know, one of the wonderful things about working with an artist who's alive, who can actually say, what the hell? Is that, like, the desire, the interest in having my expertise with an artist's work reshuffled, the deck of cards reshuffled when I see a new work. Like, whoa, that forces me to rethink all kinds of things and how I approach the work. That's one of the stresses. I may develop my own kind of private criteria where I become rigid and hard, and that's what I try to avoid.
We've got time for just one last question.
Okay, as a Christian artist, rather than leaving God over here, but working to please Him and asking Him to be a part of that art, when you're done with that and you've done your best and you really feel like you've been listening to Him and wanting to please Him, then can't you just be free and say, this is His, it's not mine, it's His. Sure. And then you don't have to go through all that turmoil of, well, what if somebody doesn't like it? God likes it because He's a part of it. Yeah,
but there are some, and there's, I mean, what it means to be an artist is shifting and shifts and changes. It depends upon, you know, the artists I work with, that's what they do, period. That's how they make a living, to keep the lights on. So to keep the lights on means you have to figure out a way that work that you make lands somewhere.
But the creator of the universe can't be a part of that?
What does it mean that He isn't a part of it?
Well,
like,
you were
the fact that I'm talking about finances, or I'm talking about, God's kind of a part of it. God's a part of it. God's there. But you have to be concerned about my representation, or I have to be concerned about how my work is. Think about it in terms of how it's understood there. He can receive there the glory. He can receive whatever it is I'm offering up. He can be right there when I'm making it, but I've got to figure out how to keep the lights on in the studio. And so I have to figure out a way that work finds those that are willing to do that. Or I need to find other ways to make a living, to augment that, to supplement that, to figure out a way that one of the, so interesting, Edvard Munch had in his studio there were 1,200 works left, which meant there were 1,200 works that he didn't sell. Which meant that he continues to make work and then he wouldn't sell the work. But he also knew that he needed to sell it. So there are different ways there are certainly legitimate practices, different ways that art is used. And someone who's an artist who makes work in different contexts for different purposes, that doesn't have any interest or need to sell the work, is making work as well, doing it differently. You know? But it also means that there's a certain kind of luxury to talk about it in ways that other artists also find that there are certain kinds of realities. So if you let's say you're a full professor in the art department at the University of Minnesota. You don't need to sell your work as an artist. You have tenure. You get paid as a faculty member. You may have an active exhibition career, but you need that exhibition career because it demonstrates research. The important thing is that you have a national, international focus with exhibitions and exhibition in recognized places, or at least recognized enough so that the dean of the college will, and the biology faculty or whoever is voting on your tenure will say, okay, that equates with whatever. But it doesn't, you don't need to sell the work. But that doesn't mean that the paintings that you're generating or the work that you're making is any less work. But it does mean, I think, that it should chasten the discourse that comes from art academics that are not part of the market. No, they don't need to be part of the market because they're part of the academic senate. Because their work depends upon their teaching load and the research that's manifest in the exhibitions. Not in the fact that they have to figure out a way to make work that people who have a little money to spend will acquire work to do whatever they need to have it do, whatever they need to have it do in their life, so that they can continue to make work for what it does for them. And that doesn't mean that that relationship for an art faculty person or a banker that paints on the weekends to unwind is any less significant. It just means there are different ways of thinking about that. Work never needs to leave that garage studio. But there are other artists, and there are artists in a particular tradition that are thinking about it in ways that you have to think about it somehow and in some way. And the compromises and the difficulties and the tensions and the pressures all are part of that. And the academic artist has tensions and difficulties. Like, how do you stay active creatively when you have tenure and there's no need to? Or your teaching load is so high, or your studio space isn't sufficient enough to get you to have you develop ways in which you want to be able to develop, and all those other kinds of issues that happen that pose challenges to making work. But those are slightly different issues. They don't have to be completely different, and there are artists on faculty that have robust art world lives, and there are artists on faculty that don't, and that have academic art world lives. There's a whole network of academic venues that help artists get tenure. Just as a reality. And all the problems with the market and the shifting of the markets and trying to figure out all those sorts of things. I don't think undermine the integrity of the creative practice. It puts legs on it. Like, and we all have those kinds of real world activities.
Good. There's so much, Rich.
Thank you so much.
Let's thank him again.